If you've ever felt like your body's betrayed you, like pleasure is something reserved for other people or something you're always getting wrong, this little corner of podcast land is for you. I'm your radical, rageful mama bear here to defend your right to feel good in your body. Welcome to season 2 of The Nature of Pleasure. This season, we're talking all about relationships and what it's like to love inside systems and family patterns that were never built for the kind of intimacy we're trying to have now. Because here's the truth. Pleasure isn't a side dish, it's not fluff, it's not a luxury, it's your body's way of saying, I'm alive, I belong, and I have power. Welcome to The Nature of Pleasure. I'm Nicole Siegel, certified sexological body worker and creator of the Body Compass Method. And this is where we unravel the quiet codes of your body, the hidden intelligence beneath desire, and the organic rhythm of your erotic nature. Hey y'all, today we are diving deep into the historical roots of the immature man. So many women feel like they're partnered with someone who never fully grew up without knowing they're carrying the weight of centuries. In this episode, we explore where emotional immaturity actually comes from, why love alone can't resolve it, and what changes when growth is finally given the space and the environment it needs. Because there's a special kind of loneliness that shows up inside relationships, the kind where you're speaking and no one is really there, even though there's a living, breathing human right in front of you. This conversation follows that feeling all the way back through history, nervous systems, and forgotten forms of initiation, and then forward toward a version of partnership most people have never been shown. There's a moment I hear women describe again and again. It's not the big blow-up fights, it's not even the obvious betrayals. It's the quieter moment, the one where you're trying to explain something that really matters to you and you can feel him disappear. His eyes glaze over, his body goes tense, his answers get short or defensive or oddly flat. And something in you thinks, why do I feel like the only adult in this room? If you've ever found yourself wondering that, if you've ever felt like you're carrying the emotional weight of your relationship, this episode is for you. Because what I want to say right at the beginning of this is that your frustration didn't come out of nowhere. It's not because you're not patient enough. And his immaturity didn't arise spontaneously either. We've been taught to make this personal, to diagnose, to pathologize, to decide he's lazy, avoidant, narcissistic, broken, or that you're asking for too much. But what if the dynamic you're living inside is actually ancient? What if the emotionally immature man isn't a modern fluke, but the result of thousands of years of cultural conditioning, spiritual, relational, nervous system level conditioning that quietly severed men from the very things that help humans mature? Because maturity doesn't just happen with age. It happens when a nervous system is initiated into feeling, into responsibility, into repair, into relationship with something larger than itself. And over time, we systematically removed almost every pathway that taught boys how to do that. We took away communal initiation, reverence for the feminine, emotional modeling, embodied rites of passage. We replaced intimacy with performance, presence with productivity, and connection with control. And then we told women, centuries later, to somehow make relationships work inside that rubble. So if you're tired, if you're resentful, if part of you loves him and part of you feels deeply alone, I want you to know this episode is not about blame men. It's not about asking you to do more emotional labor. It's about understanding the soil this dynamic grew out of. Because when you understand the soil, something incredible becomes possible. Not excuse making, not self-abandonment, but real compassion. The kind that softens defensives, shifts relational fields, and makes growth possible where it once felt impossible. By the end of this episode, my hope is that you'll see your partner and yourself through a wider lens, one that doesn't shrink you, one that doesn't harden you, one that gives you more choice, more clarity, and more power. We were told that maturity is automatic, that if someone grows older, they should naturally grow wiser, more emotionally available, or capable of intimacy. But that's not actually how maturity works. Maturity isn't something time gives us. It's something culture cultivates, environment cultivates, relationships cultivate. It emerges when a nervous system is supported again and again to feel, to repair, to take responsibility, to belong to something larger than the self. And when those supports disappear, something else grows in their place. Not evil and not malice, but immaturity, frozen places, defensive places, underdeveloped capacities that never got the chance to unfold. So when we talk about the immature man, we're not talking about a personality flaw. We're talking about a human being who grew up inside a system that quietly dismantled the pathways into relational adult. And to understand that, we have to go back much further than modern dating culture, further than your childhood, even further than his parents. We have to go back to a time when emotional maturity wasn't learned in therapy. It was learned in ritual, in community, in the body, in relationship with the feminine. Because there was a time, many times across many cultures, when boys didn't become men just by surviving long enough. They were initiated, not into dominance or conquest, but into responsibility and reverence and relational awareness. And what's important here is this: those initiations did not happen in isolation. They happened in relationship to the feminine, to women, to mothers, elders, priestesses, to the cycles of nature itself. Maturity required proximity to life-giving forces, to birth, death, pleasure, grief, seasons, sexuality. It required learning how to hold intensity without fleeing it, how to feel without collapsing, how to take responsibility for one's impact. And when those pathways existed, men grew differently. They didn't grow perfectly, but relationally. So the question isn't what's wrong with men today. The real question is what was taken away slowly, systematically, that once helped men grow. There was a time when feminine power wasn't just symbolic, it wasn't decorative or relegated to the home or the private sphere. It was central to everything. Across ancient cultures, the feminine represented life itself: birth, death, sexuality, nourishment, rhythm, renewal. And men didn't mature away from this power, they matured in relationship to it. Becoming an adult meant learning how to stand in proximity to life's intensity without trying to dominate it, without shutting down, without fleeing. The feminine wasn't something to conquer, it was something to attune to. And attunement, and this is key, is the foundation of emotional maturity. But over time, something profound shifted. As goddess traditions were dismantled and replaced by patriarchal religious systems, feminine power didn't just lose status, it became dangerous. Sexuality became sinful, pleasure became suspect, emotion became a liability. The body became something to control rather than listen to. And with that shift, men lost their primary initiation ground. Instead of learning maturity through relationship, reverence, and embodiment, they were taught to prove themselves through dominance, obedience, hierarchy, and suppression. The goal wasn't to feel more, it was actually to feel less. The goal wasn't to become relationally skilled, it was to become invulnerable. And here's the part that matters for your relationship today. When we removed the feminine from positions of spiritual authority, we didn't just disempower women. We left men without a map into emotional adulthood. So boys learned to harden early, to disconnect from their sensitivity, to turn their aliveness into armor. And what we now call immaturity, the shutdowns, the avoidance, the defensiveness, the emotional absence, those aren't random traits. They're the echo of a system that taught boys that closeness was unsafe and that maturity meant control, not connection. If you've ever felt like you're trying to have a relational conversation with someone who was never given the tools to be there, you're not imagining it. You're feeling the absence of a lineage that once taught men how to stay present with life and with love. And I want to pause here and name something really important. When I talk about the feminine being removed from the center of spiritual and cultural life, I'm not talking about women alone. Femininity doesn't live inside women. It lives across bodies, across sexes, across nervous systems. The feminine that I'm referring to is a set of human capacities that we have learned to associate with the female form, that we have learned to associate with female bodies. The ability to attune, to feel, to sense nuance, to stay present with vulnerability, to listen to the body, to respond instead of dominate. Every human being is meant to develop those capacities. So when a culture suppresses what we nowadays call the feminine, that ability to feel, to attune, to sense, to nuance, and I have a lot of opinions about assigning specific qualities to gender. So if you're interested in that, check out my other episode on that. I'll try to link it in the show notes below. When a culture suppresses what we call the feminine, it doesn't just harm women, it starves everyone. Boys lose access to the parts of themselves that know how to feel deeply, to name emotions, to metabolize fear and grief and longing without armoring. Girls are forced to overdevelop those capacities, often carrying emotional responsibility for entire systems, while being told they're too much for having them. And this is why the immature man makes perfect sense, not because men are deficient, but because so many boys were taught to abandon half of their humanity in order to survive. They weren't taught how to integrate tenderness with strength. They were taught to split. And emotional maturity requires integration. It requires access to both firmness and softness, agency and attunement, structure and feeling. So when you're sitting across from a man who can't stay present in emotional intensity, you're not seeing a lack of what we call masculinity. You're seeing a loss of internal balance, a nervous system that was never allowed to develop the feminine capacities to make intimacy possible regardless of gender. And when we understand that, the story shifts from blame to context and from resentment to clarity. The question goes from what's wrong with him to what never had a chance to grow. And those ancient lessons of an incomplete definition of masculinity persists today. It shows up in boyhood, where very early on, boys learn which parts of themselves are welcome and which parts are dangerous. They learn it in the small moments, the time he cries and is told to toughen up, the time he's overwhelmed and is sent to his room instead of helped, the time his sensitivity is mocked, the time his curiosity about his body is shamed, the time his fear is labeled weakness. And it happens over and over again. And slowly, boys learn something very specific. Feeling is unsafe, needing is shameful, and asking for help makes me smaller. So he adapts by tightening, intellectualizing, distracting, performing, checking out, because staying connected didn't feel survivable. And those emotions that he doesn't feel full access to anymore, they still live in his nervous system as tension and anxiety, irritability and shutdown, rage, numbness. So when you're sitting across from an adult man who can't name what he feels, who gets defensive when emotions rise, who avoids difficult conversations, who says, I don't know, and truly means it, you're not looking at someone who doesn't care. You're looking at someone who was never taught how to stay with the full internal experience. This is what people really mean when they say men are emotionally immature. But I want to be really precise here. It's not immaturity in the sense of selfishness or refusal. It's immaturity in the sense of underdevelopment, like a muscle that hasn't been exercised or a language that wasn't taught. Because often the first place a man is ever asked to develop these skills, it's inside of an intimate relationship, which puts women in an impossible position because suddenly she's not just a partner. She's the translator, the emotional mirror, the initiator, the container, and she can feel it in her body, the exhaustion, the resentment, the loneliness that creeps in when she's holding the relational center alone. And I want to give you a little nature metaphor here just to bring this all home. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you know that I often rely on this comparison of the evolution and the growth of nature to our own evolution and growth. When we look at nature, we don't moralize growth. A tree doesn't get judged for growing crooked. We don't accuse it of being lazy or unmotivated. We look at the conditions that it was growing under, the soil, the weather, the storms it endured early on, the light it did or didn't receive. And when a tree bends or twists, we understand something instinctively. It grew the way it needed to in order to survive. Human nervous systems are no different. When you start seeing your partner through this lens, you stop focusing only on the wound, the shutdown, the defensiveness, the immaturity, and you begin to see the root, the conditions that shaped him, the environment that required him to armor, the lack of support that made sensitivity unsafe. And here's the part that often surprises women. Seeing the root doesn't make you softer in a way that costs you. It actually gives you more clarity, because when you understand the soil something grew out of, you stop blaming yourself for not being able to fix it. You realize this was never about you doing something wrong. It's about two nervous systems trying to relate within the cultural scaffolding that makes relational maturity possible. And this is where compassion becomes clean, because tending an ecosystem doesn't mean becoming the soil yourself. It means understanding what's missing so you can decide together how to create the conditions where growth can finally happen. This is the moment where compassion doesn't trap women in overfunctioning, but actually frees them from it. Love this podcast? Tell the internet. Leave a 5-star review and make the machines work for our pleasure for once.